Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing today, which is about taboos.
I know it's strictly taboo.
You know, the things you're not supposed to talk about in church, that I, the pastor of said church, want to talk about. Fun. Taboo is a Polynesian word or a Samoan word or somewhere in the Pacific Islands sort of word that basically meant a prohibition, first and foremost, on things that were eaten. We don't use it that way so much now. A taboo generally is an issue that's not discussed, which is primarily what I wanted to talk about today. But maybe more generally, we think that taboos, things that are forbidden, whether they are eaten or spoken or practiced, exist in all sorts of cultures, not just the Pacific Islands. For example, in Judaism, as we read in Scripture, we know that there are all kinds of kosher food laws, and there are certain foods that are not to be eaten. It's the case in the United States that to eat horse would be highly frowned upon. There are other things maybe we don't eat, some things that are legally protected. And so food is a major source, even in the Bible, of taboos. And of course, we would never want to eat any person. Cannibalism is somewhat frowned upon. That's a joke. It's been a while since I've done my justice class. Whenever I talked about cannibalism, it felt like every week. But nonetheless, don't eat anybody. Taboo. What about the things we're not supposed to speak about? In certain settings, in certain contexts, certain language or words are frowned upon. So generally, in a civilized democracy like ours, things that would seem prejudicial are uncouth. You either say that for the locker room or the bar, and if that those jokes, those stories, those things ever seem to pop out, they cause nothing but trouble because it's taboo. Those thoughts, those opinions, those sayings, those practices maybe are not supposed to get out. That's what makes it taboo. And the shame or the condemnation that is cultural is heaped on people. Seemingly across cultures there are ways that shame comes on those who would break certain taboos in food, in practices, in eating, or in other arenas. A taboo is a certain way that we talk about censorship, but it's not quite censorship. Instead, because censorship generally is, especially now, regulated, as in there are laws and policies and institutional structures that say you can't say those things. Lenny Bruce and George Carlin famously kind of pointed that out with George Carlin's 7 dirty words, which are, I'm not going to say. I'm saying them in my head now, and that's probably not great either. So what is the point? I wonder for us, within the church, if we can say explicitly that there are certain taboo topics that we do not express or condone. Because my impulse is to say that the church is a space for all sorts of discussion. Of course, there are norms. Sociologically, I think any good sociologist could go to any particular group of people and point out these are preferred practices, this is the well-worn path forward for certain foods that you eat, or ways to speak or ways of behaving. And here are less worn paths, the kind of gray middle where some people do and some people don't act, eat, or speak in certain ways. And here are the things that are specifically off topic. But taboos are generally not explicit. It's somehow in the lessons that the dads have with sons in the car, that moms have with girls in the bedroom, where you suggest, you hint, you see people flex or give side eye because certain, again, foods, thoughts, actions, or words are out of bounds. And that's what I've been musing on. Is it the case that the church reinforces religious taboos where certain ways of thinking, certain ways of behaving are very explicitly condemned? Or is it the place that the church, especially a Presbyterian church, a church that generally prides itself on being academic, being well educated, focusing on education, is it a place where, kind of like the academy or a university, there's free thinking? There's plenty of space to say whatever avenues you have to explore, you should explore them. So, what are those avenues? What are those things that seem taboo? What's taboo to you? Where do you start to feel uncomfortable whenever you find yourself in a certain kind of conversation or a certain situation? These are the things I've been musing about. And so if you'd like to hear more about all of this church taboo stuff, maybe you'll stick around. Shellfish is unacceptable in Judaism, at least in Orthodox Judaism. It's forbidden. I already mentioned that horse is highly frowned upon as we eat it. Other things become culturally unacceptable or less and less acceptable. We have laws, like I've said, against polluting. But plastic straws, which I've mentioned before in my musings, are becoming a little socially, culturally frowned upon in a different sort of way. Single-use plastics, in the case of climate change and pollution and how we think about eco-stewardship or earth care, they get bad looks. And then silicone straws or metal straws get a lot of attention. Obviously we can talk about it, it's not that big of a deal, but I do wonder, is that the sort of thing, the ways you've learned about single-use plastics and how they're bad, and alternatives to single-use plastics, which are good, the ways you've learned about those, is that what makes it taboo? Where something is privileged, people encourage it, organic food, locally sourced, environmentally friendly, these are good, and the things that are over and against that are bad. Brand association, McDonald's, plastic cup, cheap food, these are not as good. These are frowned upon. Although I've had myself a few M&M McFlurries. They taste pretty tasty. Is that a taboo that I'm breaking? I don't know. If we struggle to talk openly about people's breaking eco-stewardship and doing things that are just a little bit naughty, and when I say a little bit naughty, I think hopefully we can agree, every once in a while, on occasion, a drive-through, which we all know is bad, might creep into our lives as a sort of temptation that we succumb to. If we can't own or confess that we do those sorts of things, or if we can't talk about how when Dunkin' Donuts switched from its styrofoam cup, which was incredibly warm and kept your coffee warm for so long, and now they've switched for environmental reasons and it's crummier, like paper straws that are better for the environment, but are crummy. They don't taste good on my lips. Are these things that we can talk about openly, or is it taboo? If it's the case that it's a struggle to name those sorts of things or confess those little bad vices that we have related to something like straws and drive-through fast food, how do we talk about things that are more serious? It's certainly the case now that we can say we are more like Presbyterians. The PCUSA has been through the battles about LGBTQIA+ people and their place to be married, to be ordained, to go to seminary, that sexual orientation should not be a barrier to one's calling. But does that mean that sexual things are not taboo anymore? You have to have kind of a lot of structure to have conversations about sex, which is in many, many societies generally taboo, to the point that it's very hard even to talk about sexual education that might happen at middle school for puberty or in high school for other sexual behaviors for teenagers. Even as statistics play out, that is when the majority of people become sexually active. So what are we saying? There are taboos around sexuality. It's hard to talk about, but even when statistics show that people become sexually active, there's very little or very bad sexual education, or it's meted out for parents to do on their own without a lot of resources, or it's given over to professionals in schools, and and parents aren't always that engaged in that sort of conversation. It's taboo, isn't it? And however you may feel about the particularities of what's taught in sex education, my main point is not that, nor is it about environmental care and plastic straws. My main concern is about the very abstract general idea of taboos. How people who might speak too openly are shamed or quieted so that taboos remain taboos. Touchy subjects remain touchy, which means people intuit somehow when and how they are appropriate for certain kinds of conversations. In the right setting, with the right people, with the right sort of parameters that somehow push against those taboos. Isn't it interesting how all that seems to work? At least I think it's very interesting. Because one of the primary thrusts of the New Testament, a major issue facing the early and new church, was circumcision. You know that because we read about it in the Bible. But when was the last time in church you had a conversation about whether circumcision matters now, for children now? I don't want to know, particularly because it's taboo, if the majority of people at Woods Church choose to have their boys circumcised. I feel like, well, that's a matter of personal choice, even though we know, without even asking, that it's largely influenced by American culture, by what you experience in a hospital, and general practices that are or were at one point religious. So even if the impulse to have children circumcised on the 8th day, as according to the sign of the covenant in the Old Testament, comes almost primarily through the notions of Judaism and then a certain brand of Christianity to us today, we don't talk about that in church, the source of where and why we might have people circumcised in the first place. Again, I'm not trying to talk about sex. I'm not really trying to talk about circumcision. I'm not really trying to talk about plastic straws. I'm trying to get to this Mr. Rogersism because I'm wearing my sweater today. A Rogersism that I like, even if I distrust it a little bit, is that what is mentionable is manageable. Rogers had quite a bit of schooling in psychology. He took several classes in his off hours. He studied with Erik Erikson, an early child psychologist, again in his office hours, and consulted with him for the television show. And it's from that school of thought that we learn what is mentionable is manageable. So that Mr. Rogers has a special ability to talk about the death of a goldfish and why we should talk to children about death. Maybe even make a TV show episode related to it. Or why we can talk about parents who fight and are divorced. Or why Mr. Rogers' public service announcement was so powerful after September 11th. And you probably have heard, even if you didn't know it was from Mr. Rogers. In terrible situations like that, what can we do? We can look for the helpers. Rogers had a comfort and an ability to say philosophically, foundationally, what is mentionable is manageable. And with that in mind and that being important to me, I wonder if the church can be a place where it becomes easier to mention the sincere and severe challenges that people face. Not that there should be no boundaries or that we go around with radical honesty telling everyone that we don't like the shape of their nose or it looks like they've gained weight or their shoes are ugly or whatever the case may be. But how we find places for things that weigh on us within the church to come off of our shoulders and for us to help one another relieve that weight about whatever the taboo topic might be. I think Woods is pretty good about trying to talk and support people in need of mental health, even if the particularities or the specifics of mental health are difficult to talk about. Generally, we just say go to the Counseling and Care Center, which might be the best course of action. It might be the case that for marriages on the rocks, and statistically we know that a lot of marriages are difficult, it might be hard when someone says, "How are you doing?" in church, in the greeting line. The first thing you say might not be, "Oh, me and the missus are fighting again." Alcoholism, all those sorts of things, I do think they maybe need boundaries. But the main point, again, because this is a musing and not a counseling session, nor am I qualified to do counseling sessions, is that we need to pay attention to the things that are hardest to speak about, not because they matter personally to us, but because there are senses of cultural shame put around them. One of my greatest moments, it was a complete surprise to me in my ministry, was that I was a camp director at Buffalo Gap Presbyterian Encampment in Buffalo Gap, Texas. It was rainy, and that camp is stuck in the 70s, which means if there is not a lot to do outside, there's not a lot to do, period. It's raining in the craft house, you can't swim in the pool, the big field that's open, there are no nice amenities. There's no arcade, the board games are all 15 years old and held together by duct tape. So what are you going to do when it rains? Especially when I'm in Bible study. Well, the camp director came to me, the chaplain, and said, Jacob, we are trying to get the mess hall set up for some inside games. I need you to hold these kids in Bible study for another 45 minutes. That means that their favorite part of camp, Bible study, that's a joke. The favorite part of camp was not Bible study, was supposed to be extended longer than anything else that day, another 45 minutes. So what am I supposed to do? I asked what they would like to do. They had no good ideas. They were campers, and I was something like a cruise director supposed to spoon feed them activities. And so I said, here's what we're going to do. Any question you've wanted to ask in church but you've never been able to, why don't you ask it? And everyone was dead silent. And so I pulled out a package of Post-it notes. I folded them in half, and I told them to write their questions anonymously first about what topics they were interested in but they weren't able to talk about in church. Out of about 40, 50 kids, I think maybe 6 or 7 of them said politics, and every other one of them said sex, because teenagers think about sex from time to time. Also, side note, so do adults. So, they wrote their questions. Most of them said they wanted to talk about sex. I didn't particularly want to do an open conversation about sex, but I said, why don't you take another Post-it note and write your particular questions on there, with the rule that none of us are sharing any personal things. We can just talk about general things. It's surprising to me what happened in that moment. They were engaged. Outside of a few people who were trying to make me blush, who asked personal questions and stuff, the questions were good, fair, reasonable questions that people need to know. And that became a memorable moment for me and for a lot of the campers. Simple things like, would 2 condoms be twice as effective as 1? And the answer is very clearly no. If you get that wrong, that's bad. It's good that you asked in case you were in need of condoms. If there are taboos around sexual education, or what a minister can or can't say, or what the boundaries are, and we do need boundaries, the challenge is that certain things that might be important or might weigh heavily on some people continue to weigh on them. As the church, what sort of place are we where what is mentionable is manageable? Because my hope would be that the church is able to manage quite a bit of the needs of our parishioners and the larger society. Many hands make light work. We are supposed to bear one another's burdens and joys, and when there are taboos that keep us from sharing those, well, I just don't know how effective the church can be under those circumstances. Remember that Paul talked about circumcision a lot. A lot was changed, a lot was opened up, and whether I'm talking about sexuality or straws or politics or whatever the case may be, I do hope that in some ways, maybe more, in the future, the church becomes a place where we can mention what our struggles are, we can mention what's on our minds, and we are a place to learn and grow. Maybe not without taboos, but with different taboos, and with lots of grace for the shame or the guilt that we might feel. That's what I've been musing about this week. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. If I was playing the exact same camp game with you, what are the topics that you really wish we could talk about in church, but we just aren't able to? Where do you feel those taboos? I'd be interested to hear. You can email me at jsnowden@woodschurch.org. Maybe I'll muse about some of those things. Thanks for your time today. I'll see you next Monday.
Taboos.